Hi, this is Jeff from the Ozark Mountains in Missouri, USA. Well, today our episode is about this little T102 with a fancy paint job. Well, somebody just sent this to me to have a new memory battery put in. And when I opened it up, I was surprised by this. This is a vintage Bodge from back in the day. They took the Molex socket out of there and kind of hacked things up to put a regular socket in so they could use a regular EEPROM. And yeah, it's not quite working right anymore, but we'll get into that. So we're going to try to rescue this machine from this Dodgy Bodgy. Let's get started. Thanks to PCBWay for sponsoring this episode. They offer an excellent quick-turn PCB prototyping service, which now has a free upgrade to the 150-160 temperature range. They also offer a wide range of services that allow you to go from idea to a finished product, including CNC machining, 3D printing, injection molding, PCB assembly. Go on over to PCBWay.com/OEM to find out more. So after installing a memory battery in this guy and polishing up the bottom side of the plexiglass here, I tried to activate that ROM in there, which is an Ultimate ROM 2, and it locked the machine up. And I thought, well, maybe that socket's just a little corroded. You know, the pins on EEPROMs can get that way. And I pulled it out. It was rather difficult to get out. And I cleaned everything up best I could. I plugged it back in, and it still locked the computer up. With the ROM out, it works fine. With it in, we get this, nothing. You'll just see the screen maybe get a little dark and the light flickers a little bit. That's it. And if we pop this guy out, and the first thing you'll notice is that I had to solder a new pin on here because all the pins looked intact when I pulled it out. I tried to read this in my EEPROM reader and it got gibberish. And I tried to clean the pins again, and this one broke off. So it was there enough to look like it was there, but it wasn't making any electrical contact. After soldering on a new pin, I could read this in my EEPROM reader just fine, but it still doesn't work. Looking down in the holes here, where the pins go, it was obvious that several of these were corroded, including the one where we had the broken pin. And you might just be able to see here, that brown stuff right there. Yep, that lines up with some corrosion we can see down the pinholes. So something's got into this socket and it's just been corroding for years. So I'll go ahead and get this circuit board pulled out of here now, and we'll get a closer look at this modification and how interesting it is. So looking at the back of our option ROM socket, it doesn't really look too bad here. We just see one Bodge wire, but if we flip it over, we see the extent of the horror. And we can see a little brown right there. That's from corrosion. We can see some corrosion through there, along here, and this stuff. And we have oodles of Bodge wires in glue. And I just noticed this. Somebody put in a Y2K modified EEPROM. And rather than pulling the original ROM all the way out, they just clipped the pins, cut these pins short, and then soldered the two together. It works, so I'm not going to mess with that. My original advice to the owner of this was, this is working, on this option ROM socket. It's working. I don't know what horrors lie underneath here, so let's just leave it alone. Then when it didn't work, I was glad it failed before I sent it back. that's a good indication that this corrosion problem will continue to get worse in the future. And so, you know, it could last 2 years or 20 years or 2 days after he gets it back. So it's a good thing that it happened when it did. So now we need to figure out how to get this apart without causing any more damage. This hot glue seems like it's still sticking pretty well. So some of these, oops, you can't see there, can you? Some of these pins are bent up and wires are soldered below and all sorts of crazy, nasty stuff. Yeah, I'm guessing maybe they did this sort of like they did this. They just clipped the pins and soldered one to the other. So I think what we'll do is we'll get the hot air gun and try to heat up this hot glue and see if we can't get this socket loose and see where that gets us. Okay, got the hot air gun here. I set it to 125°C, which is warm enough to soften our hot glue, but hopefully not overheat anything. I'm just going to try to get that glue warm and scrape it out of there. Just using a spudger for that. So we'll just go around and do that, and when I get to the point I think we can get the socket off there, I'll turn the camera back on. Well, this big pile of hot glue came out from that socket, and indeed it looks like they just clipped off the pins of the original Molex somehow and soldered the pins of the socket to it. This whole end is not connected. So I think I found a loose wire here too. I think I'm just going to try to carefully snip these pins off. So we can see what's going on in there. Okay, there we go. Is that just glue that's left there? Yeah, gosh, a bit of glue. Okay. Blurry. So you can see all the corrosion along here. You can see it there. And just a little along this side. It must have mostly stayed up in the socket. Oh yeah, I can see it here in the socket, this orangey color. Don't know what that was. It's rather odd. Oh, you know what I bet? Because I see similar corrosion on the ROM they did here. They used acid core flux. Plumbing flux, not electronics flux. Yeah. I bet that was it. Which means I'm going to have to pull the EEPROM out of there too and redo that. Okay. So now I guess the next step is to heat up the soldering iron and extract these pins. Get the rest of this hot glue off of here and see what damage has been done to the circuit board. So far it doesn't look too bad. Not as bad as I feared. Well, I've got my official soldering glasses on here, so let's see if we can't clean this up. What I'm going to try to do is, okay, that pin pushed down in there pretty easy. I have to hold the board up up a little to do that. Yep, okay. So I can pop that side cutter into the board and heat up each pin stub and just push it through. They still have bits of bodge wire stuck to them. So nice of Tandy to decide to use a non-standard pinout for the option ROMs. And then they never did release that many or any EEPROMs that actually worked, so it made third-party software really difficult. Eventually a few companies came out with a little flex board wrapper you could put around a standard EEPROM to get it to work. Those can be a little flaky after all these years. And of course now we can get circuit boards made with 3D printed carriers that do a very good job of snapping into those odd Molex sockets. Okay, so this is working okay. That big blob of solder and hot glue there. Now when you get this junk all over your soldering iron tip, keep that wiped off really good using a sponge and one of these little copper mesh deals, because that type of junk will really ruin a tip. Okay, so I'll finish cleaning out these holes and we'll see what we have to work with. Now that I've got this side reasonably clean, we'll start on the back and heat up one pin at a time and pull it out with some little tweezers. If you try to use the vacuum desoldering iron on these broken pins, you'll clog it up for sure, because it'll suck those right up in there, and then you'll have to clean out your machine. Before sucking the solder out of these holes, I decided it would be a good idea to get the remnants of this hot glue off of here. That way I'm not getting hot glue back down in the holes. I recalled that there's some types of hot glue that alcohol will soften up, so got some alcohol here and I'm just wetting the surface that has the glue on it, and I'm running over that carefully with my spudger, and it does seem to be releasing the hot glue. Seems to be cleaning off there fairly nicely. So get this cleaned off of here. I got all the pins out. I put some flux and solder on each empty hole from the back side, and so it should desolder fairly well once I get all this nasty glue off of here. That cleaned up a lot better than I thought it would, and I don't see any hacked up traces on this side. I kept soaking this with alcohol and scrubbing it with a stiff bristled brush and the tough spots I would get with my little plastic spudger, and then with some alcohol and Q-tips, cleaned it up some more. That did a really good job. So I'm going to get the solder out of all these holes, and then we'll see about fitting the original Molex socket. I've got this circuit board here. You might remember this from a few years ago. A friend sent it to me and I tried to fix it for him. It had a lot of corrosion in this area from a leaking battery, and there's a few dozen traces here that were ruined. And there was a chip down in this area that we replaced, here and here. I think one or both of those was bad. And it got to the point it wasn't worth trying to fix anymore. There's a lot of corrosion under the parallel port connector here even. So I had a spare board that I traded him, and so I'm going to take the Molex socket off of this to put here, and I will take this socket, which was here for an option RAM originally, and I'm going to move it down to this one for the ROM. So I'll get the parts desoldered from here and clean these holes out, and then we will start soldering stuff back up, see how it works. Going to add a little more flux to these guys. That not only helps the solder flow better, but it mixes with the junk that's in the solder and will help bring it to the surface, and then we'll desolder this. Of course. No matter what you do, your desoldering tool likes to clog up. Okay. Got a little more solder there. That one must have, oh yeah, that's got a big copper fill on this side. So when you're trying to transfer all the heat through just the via, it's hard to get these big copper pores hot enough. So it's easier to do it from the side that it's on. There we go. And maybe this one here. Yeah, now we should be able to get the rest of these from the bottom. Okay, so I'll finish desoldering these guys and rescue those sockets from the other board, and we will continue. I looked at all the traces here under magnification, and there was a few I was worried about, so I ohmed them out, and everything was okay, so we can go ahead and put in our reclaimed socket. Before I pulled this socket out of the old board, I did take a picture to make sure I got the orientation right. Don't want to put that guy in there upside down. Got him slipped in there now. Fold over a couple pins just to hold him in place. Like so. It is seated all the way. And then we will solder it up. I'm just going to start getting opposite corners here. Then I'll push the socket up to the board. And reflow those two. There we go. Okay. Now we know that our socket is flush to the board. And we can get the rest of our pins. And you want to leave your iron on here, 2 or 3 seconds. You got to do it long enough to make sure it flows all the way through. For our ROM here, I've got most of the pins done. My process has been to add just a bit of fresh solder, let it stay on there 3 or 4 seconds, and I'm hoping that will loosen the original pin and it'll stay attached to where it was soldered to the new EEPROM. Now this one I'm trying to wiggle and it's still stuck down pretty good. So there's probably a big copper pore on the other side. So I'll add a little more solder. I'll let it heat up a few more seconds. And when I'm wiggling like that, I'm not pressing down onto the board. You don't want to scrub the pad off the board. Okay, now that's wiggling. Okay, let's see about this one. The reason you want to try to wiggle the pin is to make sure you've got it fully desoldered. See, that one's tight. It's not really moving. Okay. Yep, just checking some of these again. It seems okay. Oh, wow. I'm kind of amazed that worked. Yeah, I have never seen that done that way before. It was an awful lot of work just to try and avoid, I guess, taking the board out. How nasty those pins look. Yeah, I imagine that was acid core solder designed for plumbing use, not rosin core, and that's what caused our corrosion all over. So I'll get these pads cleaned up on both sides with some alcohol, and then we'll solder in the new socket. This EEPROM we originally pulled out of the option ROM socket. It's actually in fairly decent shape, except for this one broken pin. Everything else cleaned up really well. It's mechanically sound. So I think we'll repurpose this as the new main ROM. It's the same type of ROM. You can reprogram it. This came out intact, so I can read from this one, program into this one, put a new label on it, pop it in there, and Bob's your uncle. Let's get the socket soldered in here. A bit of handheld shaky cam here. We got the sockets fitted, the Molex socket for the original type of option ROM. I fitted a socket for the main ROM, and after pulling out this Franken ROM, I was able to read it, and I verified it several times, so it was okay. And I erased the original option ROM, which had the one broken pin there, and tried to program it. It would not program, so I had to get a new EEPROM, and I programmed it with the code off the original ROM. And I've got my bench power supply connected here. So I don't have the LCD or keyboard hooked up. All I'm going to do here is power it up, make sure the current draw looks correct. It should be, 40, 50-ish milliamps in that range. If it is, everything's running and it should be okay. And then we'll hook the test harness to it to get a good health indication on this particular board. Just turned on the memory backup battery, but it draws so little on charging we won't see it here. And we'll turn on the power switch. So yeah, a brief spike in about 50 milliamps, so it's running. If there's a bus problem and it shuts down, it'll be like 20 milliamps. So this board should be okay to go ahead and hook the test harness to, and then we'll see how it works. We've got the test harness hooked up here. It kind of has an interconnection board that plugs into the system bus. It goes to the cassette, BCR port, serial port, parallel port. It checks all of those. You have this little ROM board here, which has its own LCD that plugs in place of the ROM. So putting that ROM socket in here made that job a lot easier. And this little clip here just picks up the right signal, since the right signal normally doesn't go to the EEPROM socket. And I'll get you zoomed in here on the LCD. Okay, when we apply power, the first thing it's going to do is a memory test. And it wants to make sure it's going to find at least one good RAM chip, so it has a place for the stack, and then it'll go into a more extensive test. And it'll test the whole system pretty well and let us know what's working and what's not. So I just got to watch the LCD for failures. I don't have the keyboard or the LCD plugged in, so we might see failures related to those. I'm going to turn on the bench power supply and output on. Turn on the power. Now the .mgg is just meaning it's finding those RAM chips and testing them. The dot means it's the first time it's going through. And of course, as soon as we start this test and I start talking, yeah, it's not seeing the LCD there, so we get a failure. That's no problem. Anyhow, I was saying, as soon as I start this test and start talking, the furnace kicks on. Never fails. And we're not testing the keyboard here because we don't have it hooked up, but I've already tested it. It's okay. And it will auto power itself down. I'm going to turn the power switch off. We'll give it a few seconds here. And when I turn it back on, you'll notice the memory test display will change a little bit, indicating that the contents were maintained by the backup battery while the system was off. Turn it back on, we see the B. That means the battery did the trick for that particular RAM chip. Yep, so this is fine. So now, I'll let this run one more time just for good measure, but I'm sure the system's fine now. And we'll get it put back together to the point where I can test it with the LCD on there. And the owner of this guy also wanted a dial-a-ROM for here, so we'll plug a dial-a-ROM in there and test it and make sure that's working fine in our newly refitted option ROM socket. Okie doke, I got the 102 popped back together. As you can see, it works. We can enter a little basic program here. Everybody's favorite test program. Where's the quotes? And it works. Okay. You can save that to the RAM. Make sure that part works. Yep. Okay. Now I am going to pop in a dial-ROM. This little guy, and I had to borrow mine because I ran out of stock of new ones of these again. So we'll turn that off. You can probably hear the bench power supply in the background. In this condition with the LCD working, it's drawn about 62 milliamps, so that's perfectly normal. Do this. And like so. I've got it set to position 0. Which is TS-DOS. Okay, I've got a backpack here. This one's naked, it ain't got any clothes on. Let's plug it in like that. It's off right now. Turn the power on, go into basic, and using the cheat sheet that you can download with the dial-a-ROM, I know that to start up TS-DOS I need to call 63013,1. Yeah, space key's kind of sticking there. Well, that's kind of curious, isn't it? It is locking up. So we still have a problem with this. That is interesting. So if I do a control break, reset. Okay. Call 63013, comma 1. Nope. We have a problem with our option ROM. Okay. Maybe a broken trace or something like that. So I'll have to pop this guy back apart and have a look at that. I spent a few hours trying to figure out why the option ROM wasn't working. And I ohmed out all the signals going to this socket. They're basically the same ones going to the main ROM. There is one difference. The ALE signal, which is buffered from the 8085, goes to the option ROM. It does not go here. And the chip enable. So all the signals we're getting here, all the traces looked good. There are 3 or 4 chips here involved in chip select between the option ROM and standard ROM. M5, M14, M26, etc. And so I kind of stopped here. I thought I was getting, making it too complicated, and wanted to come up with some simpler ways to test this before I started pulling chips off the board. So I sent a message to my friend, the one who created the test harness, and just explained to him, the problem I was having and what I'd done so far. And I said, just thinking out loud, said, what would happen if you tried to start up the option ROM when it wasn't in there? I'm guessing it's going to lock up. And I told him, I said, well, I can get out my 102 and try that because I know it works. So I was using it with the dialer ROM. So I did that, and sure enough, it locked up my 102 with no option ROM in there. And then I plugged in the option ROM to it and tried to start it up, and it also locked up. I thought, I was using this in there. Why did it lock up? So I looked at the position I had the switch set to, and I actually had it set to 0. And looking at the cheat sheet, switch 0 is TS-DOS, but it's for the Model 200, not the Model 100. So that was the problem. When I was trying to start up TS-DOS, it was trying to run Model 200 code on this, and it wouldn't work, so it locked up. So it was something simple. It was user error on my part, and I wasted a couple hours chasing down a ghost. But it kind of illustrates the point. Sometimes when you're getting in pretty deep, it's worth taking a pause and doing something else, thinking about it. I even find trying to compose a sensible question to somebody else about the problem. A lot of times I'll send an email to somebody about something, and by the time I'm done writing the email, I figured out the problem. It's just that act of writing something out so somebody else can understand the problem and what you've done and try to solve it. Kind of that transferring the jumble in your brain to this linear flow through time helps out a lot. So I'm going to put this back together once again. We'll pop the option ROM in there, start it up, talk to a backpack, and just triple check that everything works. Okay, I've got her back together. It fired up. I've got a backpack connected. You can probably hear the bench power supply. I've got it running so I can check the current draw on this. It's about 62 milliamps, which is pretty normal. And now if we go into basic and do a call 63013, 1, we have indeed started up TS-DOS. I'm going to turn the backpack on, go into disk. I'm going to go into the test 01 directory, and I'm going to load Hey 2 as the same file name. Go back to root. Go back to RAM. Yep, it is in RAM. Go back to the main menu, and we'll run everybody's favorite test program. Isn't that exciting? So embarrassingly, that last little hiccup there at the end was all because I had a switch set in the wrong position. Kind of embarrassing, but we did get it figured out eventually. Well, we managed to get this T102 up and running again. We got rid of that nasty old botched in socket, the corroded EEPROM that went along with it, and even this Frankenstein EEPROM that was replacing the main ROM. I really think all this corrosion on these things was because somebody used acid core flux. That's what it looks like to me. I don't know anything else that would cause that sort of corrosion. We're able to reuse parts off of a donor board. That's a good way to use these boards that are beyond being able to repair. Had a little glitch there at the end trying to test the dialer ROM and that new option ROM socket, but that was due to the faulty firmware in my noggin. I had the switch set to the wrong spot. But we got there, it works, and now this is going to be reliable for the owner. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. Just leave them in that comment section that's down there below. Thanks to everyone who helps support the Hey Birt channel through Patreon and other means. It's greatly appreciated. And until next time, bye.